Welcome to Social Science is the Basic podcast with Professor Mohtar Mas'oed.
Good morning. Welcome to the podcast program for Social Sciences, the Basic. This program is produced by IUP, International Undergraduate Program of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada. Okay. This time we are going to talk about history and international relations. And we have two main topics. First is how is IR related to the study of history? Okay. The second topic is how has history been used in the study of international relations? First, what is history? Okay. In Greek language, historia means is inquiry or knowledge acquired by investigation. History is the academic discipline which uses narrative to describe, examine, question, and analyze a sequence of past events, investigate the pattern of cause and effect that are related to the past events. Okay. Historians seek to understand the past by determining and ordering facts, and from this narrative, historians hope to explain the decisions and processes in the past which shape our existence today. What historians do? Historians explore, interrogate, and understand the very nature of realness itself in history, demonstrate the existence of a necessary link between history as a reflection on the past and human life. And the third, historians interpret past realities and to seek significance, explanation, and the meaning of the past events. Why is it important for IR students to learn about history? Let me read an argument posed by a scholar named Lloyd Pettiford. He said that any history is in fact a discourse and not necessarily tautology, not necessarily the story that's clear enough for us to read. Okay, this is a discourse. Once a moment in time has passed, the events or facts of that moment can only be represented and portrayed through human discourse and narrative. As a result, much IR theory that does include historical analysis is based not upon fact, but on stories. Okay, facts that's already told by somebody else. So the methodological question is, how do we know the truth of the story? How to prove the validity of historical facts, quote unquote. That's why IR theories need to engage with the issue of factual historical representation by analyzing historical discourse themselves. So they do not take facts as it is, because the facts came to us via discourses, written by historians. Discussion of history and their use in IR, therefore, are very important. Why? Because history is often used to influence perception of oneself, the perception of others, and to influence an event or processes. Okay, sometimes history is drawn upon to legitimize certain types of actors, certain policy, and certain behavior. You know this debate about the history everywhere, including in Indonesia, always heated, especially if this involve somebody in power. Up to now, we still debated what happened in 1965, and that's the evidence that history is always problematic for IR. This makes understanding not only history, but also discourse on history is essential. You need to probe the facts, and you need to see what happened in the discourse of the facts. It is widely acknowledged that histories are often written by the winners of war, or written by those that are in position of power. See, the history of Indonesia in 1960s was written by the winner of the conflict in 1965. Okay. The history of World War also mostly written by the victors of the war. And that's the problem with history. How scholars theorize history. Remember that when we talk about geography, social psychology, and sociology, you know that the scholars, when they answer the question, they try to answer it in an abstract term. And the abstract term is called theory. So basically, there are several theories of history telling. One of the theories is called cyclical theory of history. According to this theory, history moves in a circle. Every event has a starting point and then develop into a climax, and after that, downfall. This process begins again and again and again. Historians hold that the rise and fall of civilization, the rise and fall of dynasty confirm this nature of history. This kind of theory is used by many scholars to write about history. I think the first modern history is written by Ibn Khaldun, titled Muqaddimah, published between 15th and 16th century. This is about the rise and fall of dynasties in Middle Eastern area. Also, books by Oswald Spengler, German, The Decline of the West. Toynbee, Study of History. And the recent one is a book by Paul Kennedy about the rise and fall of nation. These all story about nation. Remember when you study history, you learn about the European countries, when they started with the expansion, of power going beyond Europe. The Portuguese came to power, and then with the rise and fall pattern, also Spanish power came up and down, and then replaced by the Dutch, and the Dutch replaced by the British, and later the British was replaced by United States. It's now in the declining process, but the American do not want to recognize that. The way you tell the story about the rise and fall of nation is very popular among the historians. The second theory is called linear theory of history. Sometime during the Enlightenment, people were not satisfied with the explanation given by the cyclical theories. They see that history is not rise and fall. History does not proceed in a cycling way. Here they see history as a straight line. Okay, because during the Enlightenment, people believe in a new idea about the progress. Once you make a progress in your life, you will not repeat what you did before. Okay, so the idea of progress adopted by this scholar is used to see history as both linear and irreversible. Once you engage in something, you make a progress, you will not go back to what you did before. So again, history moved forward along a linear line. So this is very revolutionary back then, during the Enlightenment, during the 17th and 18th century. Okay. People like Voltaire, who lived in late 17th and up to 18th century, and H.G. Wells also lived in 19th century up to 20th century. They believe that the idea of social progress. Okay, again, this idea said that what happened yesterday will not repeat itself today. What happens today will not repeat itself tomorrow. This kind of idea enables scholar to see the development of nation, the development of society. From this line of thinking came the idea that nation can develop. Once you produce more and you save some, and then you can grow as an economy beyond what you achieved yesterday, and you accumulate this way. And from this idea came the theory of economic development. Okay, the linear theory of history. The third theory actually is combining those two and came up with the dialectical way of seeing history. So the dialectical theory of history, see history is a constant process of dialectic conflict, with each thesis encountering an opposing idea or even antithesis. The clash of both between thesis and antithesis was merged into a synthesis, a combination which conserved the contradiction between thesis and antithesis, but both of them are assimilated into one. Okay, that's what synthesis. So the synthesis is the result of the clash between thesis and antithesis that represent new knowledge. In history, the process is illustrated this way. If Louis XVI monarchic rule in France was seen as a thesis, France's revolution could be seen as its antithesis. However, both were assimilated in Napoleon, who reconciled the revolution with the Longchamp regime, and that way he conserved the change. So Napoleon came up with the synthesis of the thesis of the Louis XVI and the antithesis of the revolution, and assimilated into synthesis that come with the Napoleonic rule. Okay. According to Hegel, social progress is the result of the labor of reason in history. Hegel viewed history as the continual refinement of intellectual understanding. However, this dialectical reading of history involved, of course, contradiction. So history was also conceived as a constantly conflicting. Hegel used idea as the basis of the relation between thesis and antithesis. Later on, Karl Marx came with the different idea. This is not idea. This is the material base of human life that in the process here. Another theory is about what's called great man theory of history. History can be explained by the impact of great men or heroes highly influential and unique individual who, due to their natural attribute such as superior intellect, heroic courage, and divine inspiration, have a decisive historical effect. Okay, so basically, history is the work of a person, great person, who has courage, who has initiative to do something, who is very active in implementing what he has in mind. So this is the theory that comes that there's no great man, no history. History is history of great men doing something great. Okay, that's the idea of historian named Thomas Carlyle, who lived in between 18th and 19th century. The great man theory assumes that every great leader is born already possessing certain traits that will enable them to rise and lead on instinct. Okay, that's the first assumption. The second assumption is the need for the leader has to be great for this trait to then arise, allowing them to lead. Okay, this is the assumption of great man theory history. This theory claims these great leaders as heroes that were able to rise against the odds to defeat rival while inspiring followers along the way. So remember that when you learn history at school, whether you're in primary school or secondary school, you always talk about the hero. In Java we have Pangeran Diponegoro. You have many heroes. So history is the result of the great man doing something great. Okay. Theories say that these leaders were then born with a specific set of traits that make them ideal candidate for leadership and role of authority and power. So leaders are not made. Okay, leaders are born. This is the you will discuss this in other classes. This is about nature or nurture, whether leader naturally born or nurtured by socialization. Okay, this is the idea. The great man theory follows the first, that leaders are born, not nurtured. Problem with the history, the theory of history is that sometimes history is used as propaganda. Some leaders manipulate history for their own agendas, and these histories in turn affect history, often so that a certain class or party will retain their power. If you are in power, you want to support the history that have a picture of you as a great person. See, so you sometimes hire person to write about your history. Okay, this is the problem with history. Michel Foucault posited that the victors of social struggle use their political dominance to suppress a defeated adversary version of historical event in favor of their own propaganda, which may go so far as historical revisionism. So you will learn in the history of humankind that new leader revise the history of their nation for the purpose of aggrandizing his role in the history. Okay. Nation adopting such an approach would likely fashion a universal theory of history to support their aim, with a teleological and deterministic philosophy of history used to justify inevitableness and rightness of their victories. This approach, used by the totalitarian and Nazi regime, which resulted in fanaticism. So Hitler wrote a book, Mein Kampf. I think the title is Mein Kampf, My Struggle. He rewrote the history of Germany for the purpose of aggrandizing the Aryan culture. George Orwell, there is a book titled 1984, written by George Orwell. It was published, written in 1948. So to make a flavor of the future, he changed the year. Instead of 1948, he wrote the title 1984. This is a fictional account of the manipulation of historical record for national aims and for manipulation of power. So the danger about this propaganda, is well written by Orwell. In the book, George Orwell wrote, "He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future." That's the propaganda is all about. Okay, the creation of a national story by way of management of the historical record is at the heart of debate about history as propaganda. To some degree, all nations are active in the promotion of such national stories with ethnicity, nationalism, gender, power, heroic features, class consideration, and important national event, and then all clashing and competing for influence within the narrative. Okay, so this is important issue for us who study IR to know that the history sometimes come to us as a propaganda, and we have to be very careful not to be deceived by that propaganda. Now we move to the topic of the utility of history to international relations. The uses of history for IR, here I have 3 points here. First, history is a ready source of examples and analogy. And analogy is useful for understanding event. Second is about historical consciousness. We need to be conscious of history. We need to understand the historical context of human existence in order to judge about human affairs. How can you judge what happens in Indonesian politics if you do not have knowledge about the historical context of that event? The third is that history can be used like a laboratory for the study of counterfactual as a means for drawing inferences or testing theory. If you want to test theory, you need a history, and history can be used as if this is a laboratory, like the scientists, like the physicists, like the biologists use laboratory. So history is our quote-unquote laboratory for studying IR. Why we need historical analogy? Why analogy? Because analogy is the efficient way of telling somebody else that do not know what happened with something that they already know. Why? Because history repeats itself. If you want to know what happened now, let me tell you that this is like what happened before. Now the enemy is invading us. Also, when American American government try to convince the people of America about the need to be always ready for enemy's invasion, they talk about the analogy of Pearl Harbor. Remember in Pearl Harbor when we were all sleeping, Japanese came and killed us. This is kind of analogy is used in the history. According to John Lewis Gaddis, science, history, and art all depend on metaphor. Whenever you try to explain something in science or in history or in art, you use metaphor. Metaphor is, you tell somebody who do not know what it is and what happens by telling them what they already know. That is the metaphor about the historical pattern. Okay, because what happened now is like what you know already, what happened before. This is the use of metaphor. Reliance on historical analogy presupposes at least some elements of continuity through history. If you believe that history is continuing event, then you will see that what happened today is not so dissimilar. It's not so different from what happened yesterday. What happened yesterday are not so different from what happened the day before. Also, what happened tomorrow, we expect it's not so different to what happened today. So there is a continuity in history. Okay, in the history, we have a lesson from the classic people like these classic scholars like Thucydides. According to Thucydides, this is a Greek scholar from 2,400 years before. According to him, human nature is unchangeable. Unchangeable in the sense that as long as you are human, you have the nature that carried with you when you were born. Okay, so if human nature aggressive, that's what you see. It's up to now people are aggressive. So also the many theories in IR believe in the macro influence of international anarchy. That's not only now, that also 1,000 years before. So historical continuity in that sense. See, history repeated itself. Although historically minded IR scholars ought to keep their eyes wide open to changes and breaks with the past, they also recognize the elements of continuity from earlier historical period. What happened 100 years ago, you can expect also, happens tomorrow. That's why the debate about the end of history was not so popular now. Remember that Francis Fukuyama wrote a book about the end of history. History is no more, meaning that we have now only one type of history. That's the history of the West, history of the liberal ideas. But now people know that history repeated itself. What happened in Greece 2,400 years ago is still taking place today. And that's the idea of the historian about the historical continuity. This tradition of history and IR collaboration continued well after IR firmly itself established as a recognized discipline sometime after World War II. Up to 1960s, when you study IR, that's basically you study history. So IR and history are not separable. But since 1960s, we have seen that IR and history separated, especially the English school. Well, when you learn about the IR theory later, you will see it's called English school and word system analysis. That's still based on history. The liberal idea, especially the liberal idealist scholar, does not believe in history. Even what is called postmodernism is antithetical to the analytical use of history, because postmodernists believe that history is another form of fiction. According to postmodernists, history and its interpretation deceive people and used sometimes as a propaganda. So this is the idea of postmodernism. But still, postmodernist critique might be correct in this respect. However, it is highly unlikely that uncountable generation of people have been victims of mass deception or mass psychosis regarding the utility history, not least in the analysis of IR. There is no chance that so many people, deceived by history. That is the critic against the postmodernism. What is different between history and IR? We will talk, remember in social sciences, the basic, we talk about different ways of knowing, different ways of studying facts. Okay, history and IR represent two ways of knowing. History deals with the past, IR deals with the present. History, methodologically, history is ideographic, emphasis of description and specification of something. History focus on and elaborate upon single events, more limited time periods. Okay, so history study some event and describe it and tell us about the details, but that's it. They don't do, they don't generalize out of that description. IR do nomothetic, meaning that from the start, IR study events like historical event with the goal of generalizing, with the goal of coming up with a generalization out of that event. So to see events in terms of existing generalization. If you study an event as an IR scholar, you see that event is only an example of larger phenomena. Again, history is mostly a description, of a historical period. IR emphasize on the analysis, emphasize on an analytical account of what happened in the world. History is about the past, and IR and political science about the present. Okay. Why? Because IR and political science basically policy oriented. They want to recommend something. They want to influence policy. But the past and present distinction is not as neat as one might think. Okay. Historical context may matter a lot, and past influences may persist for long. Historians often do have an eye for the present or even for the future. Okay. It means that historians not only see the past, historians also write something about the present and the future. So the difference between IRs about the present and history about the past is not as neat as we might think. The difference is not so clear-cut. Salient past events still command widespread interest for their own sake, and IR scholars who analyze them in the course of theoretical quest cannot help improving the general understanding of those particular events. Even now, you still discuss the war that took place 2,400 years ago. Okay, you still read the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides. I will come up again with this later. So even if you divide, you differentiate between history as the science of the past and IR as the science of present, that's not so neatly defined. Okay. The most important differences between IR and history is that IR emphasize on the nomothetic in terms of the methodology studying event, IR always look for generalization. They don't study an event for the sake of the event. IR study an event as part of talking about the more general issues. So IR scholars explicitly aim to arrive at general proposition of wider applicability. Ability to formulate proposition of general applicability is an important goal of IR scholars. So historians might be satisfied with ideography, and do not want to generalize from particular cases because they place a high value of contingency, something unforeseen. See, historians always be careful because sometimes something happen without being acknowledged by the observer. Okay, what is called a contingency, unforeseen circumstances. Okay, history deals with description, IR deals with analysis. Description in the sense that history deals with what happened and how. So this is a descriptive account. IR focuses on the question why it happened. This is analytical account. Analysis and description can be conceived as ends of a continuum. So historians give greater detail than IR scholar, but historians sometimes apply theories too. So the difference between IR and history not supposed to be conflated, because we need to find how to bridge the gap between IR and history. That way, we can start by saying that academic distinction between history and social science are accidental, artificial, and detrimental. And we need to bridge the gap. We need to make the differences, can be accommodate to each other. And the question is how? Okay. We need to develop what is called interdisciplinary approach. On the one hand, IR may need to delve deeper into historiography in the course of their research. But on the other hand, historians may have much to gain by incorporating the theoretical insight of the social sciences, including IR. So history need to see that IR might be useful for them. IR need to see that history is also useful for IR. So historians that want to write analytical history, not only purely descriptive history, they can analyze past political events by using the findings, the theory of political science, or IR. That's we need to encourage collaborative teaching by historian and IR scholar. This is what we call interdisciplinary approach. That way we can integrate the study of history and the study of IR into an interdisciplinary studies that is more useful for both disciplines. Okay. Now let's move to the historical studies that has been done so far. And we start with the classics. We start with the scholar who wrote a piece of history 2,400 years ago. The piece called History of the Peloponnesian War. This is a war between Athens versus Sparta. Why the war? Why Athens fight Spartan? According to the Thucydides' thesis, he wrote in the book, what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. This emphasis on power distribution and uneven development was a quantum leap in the study of IR. 2400 years ago, this scholar already mentioned about the cause of the war, and he mentioned about the unequal power distribution, between Athens and Sparta. Athens was very progressive in terms of capital accumulation and become rich, become powerful as economic power, and then develop military power that grew faster than Sparta. And that create a fear within Sparta about the growth of power of Athens. And this is, for IR study, this is very important to see because that was 2400 years ago. That at that time, another historian called Herodotus still relied on mythology and still relied on human passion as the cause of the war. But Thucydides already mentioned this is nothing about mythology. This is about economic development and military development. That's what made Spartan people were afraid and then created a tension between them and the war. So the lessons learned from Thucydides is that he combines narrative accounts, this is the realm of history, and generalization account, this is the realm of IR, into general proposition. So Thucydides 2400 years ago already a modern scholar in that sense. So again, he created a general proposition of the danger of appeasement. Okay, if you give in, you will immediately be confronted with some greater demand, since they will think that you only gave way on this point through fear. But if you take a firm stand, you will make it clear to them that they have to treat you properly as equals. The lesson learned from 2400 years ago about appeasement can be used to explain the policy of British Prime Minister Chamberlain. His appeasement policy to Hitler is considered as part of the cause of World War II. See, when you appease an aggressive enemy, you will make things worse. That's the lesson that we learn from Thucydides. Polybius is another classic. He wrote about the rise of Rome to universal dominance within little more than a century. Okay. Lesson learned from Polybius is he introduces the word system. Only universal history was meaningful history. Local histories were bound to distort the picture by magnifying relatively minor factors and events. Next comes Ibn Khaldun. He wrote a comparative history on the Arab and the Middle East in 14th century. Lesson learned from Ibn Khaldun is that the account of the rise and declines of state due to the influence of their domestic structure are still very important to learn today. He discerned pattern what would now be called power transition, a condition in which the powerful state was challenged by the newcomer, and this make a dilemma for the powerful state. This is I will come back to this later with the American and Chinese relation. Another book is by Machiavelli, okay, The Prince. The Prince, the book by Machiavelli, is a political analysis supported by many historical illustrations. It is written in elegant but simple language and considered as manual of how to win power and how to keep power. Machiavelli argued that success of a state, regardless of the political system by which it was governed, was determined by the character and resourcefulness of its individual leaders. Okay, so he emphasized the important role of leaders. So it depends on the leaders. If they can play a good game, then the state he led will be successful. So this is a book about history, but with a lot of political analysis. There is some quote from Machiavelli: "The main foundation of every state, new states as well as ancient or composite one, so the main foundation of every state are good laws and good arms. You cannot have good laws without good arms. And where there are good arms, good laws inevitably follow." So you need to have a good military power, and with that you can create order. The one who adapts his policy to the times prospers, and likewise that the one whose policy clashes with the demands of the times does not. So meaning that leadership should change according to the times. Okay, if you do not want change, then you will not get successful. Here I have a good quote from Machiavelli: "The lion cannot protect himself from traps. The fox cannot defend himself from wolves. So one must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and be a lion to frighten wolf." So sometimes you have to be lion, but some other time you have to be a fox. This is the analogy given by Machiavelli. Now let me show you some historical analysis in I.R. scholars' work. I.R. scholars like Edward Carr and Hans Morgenthau were influenced by history. In the book titled 20 Years Crisis, Carr critiqued the idealism that had dominated I.R. after World War. Okay, so this is the classic books by two scholars who were considered as the founding father of modern I.R. The second book is by Hans Morgenthau, titled Politics Among Nations. This is also political analysis with many historical example illustration. I want to show you several books that already use historical facts to support the political analysis. Okay, another book by Quincy Wright, titled A Study of War, published in 1942. This is a book about I.R. supported by historical facts, and this is really interdisciplinary. He used insight from a variety of disciplines, from I.R., history, psychology, economics, political science, anthropology, law, sociology, and you name it. Okay, so this is what I want you to learn. You are I.R. student, but you need the support of other social sciences. Okay, and another book by this is not only book. This is very long books. Okay. I think it consists of 10 or 12 volumes by Arnold Toynbee, A Study of History. Okay, this is the study the evolution of civilization in historical account, but also with some political analysis. For more recent one is Henry Kissinger, A World Restored. This is a historical case study using IR analysis for explaining why Europe was stable for 60 years after Napoleonic War. Okay, this is the book by Henry Kissinger, a scholar who later become diplomat and become advisor to American president, and I think he was also one time a foreign minister, or in American tradition it's called Secretary of State. This is actually secretary dealing with foreign affairs. Okay, and later we have also Paul Kennedy's book titled The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. Okay, this book I mentioned here to show you that IR and history has been done in an interdisciplinary way. That's for make it more useful for people who study history and IR. Okay. Important lesson from Kennedy is that he said something like wealth is usually needed to underpin military power, and military power is usually needed to acquire and protect wealth. Okay, so there is a balance between economic productivity and military expenditure. Paul Kennedy discerned historical pattern. According to him, great powers, in order to remain great power, had a task that was simple to understand but difficult to exercise. That is, great powers need to balance wealth and their economic base with their military power and strategic commitment. So great power like United States is very wealthy and economic base is very strong. They need to have a military power and need to develop strategic commitment, not only taking care of their own country, they need to take care of security of others. Now, this is a balance. If you fail to keep the balance, that you will have problem. It's not easy to balance wealth and their economic base with their military power and strategic commitment. This is what Americans now undergoing. They have strategic commitments all over the world. They spend a lot of money for military purposes, and that's create problem with economic base. Okay, so the problem with American now is that you are overstretched. You have so many strategic commitment, and with your economy now deteriorating. Okay, and this is the theory. The main theory posed by Paul Kennedy is that you have to balance your economic power with your military and strategic commitment. If you cannot maintain the balance, you will have problems. Lastly, I will give you a case study done by Graham Allison, who applied Thucydides' theory today. Okay, the subject is about American and Chinese competition today. Okay, the question is, are the US and China headed for war? This is published in Atlantic magazine, and later published in a book titled Destined for War. Can China and the United States escape Thucydides' trap? Because according to Thucydides, when established power is challenged by the newcomer, and then they could not settle that because the rising power want to have a chunk of power, and the established power are not ready for that, and then the possibility of war between them is increasing. And Graham Allison used 16 cases from the first half of 16th century to 1990s of the 20th century, and he found 12 out of 16 cases, relation between China and United States today tend toward war. This is the study by Graham Allison to see the future of United States and China relation by using a theory that was created 2400 years ago. And with this, I will end this class today. I have tried to show you how history can help IR scholar to understand better international phenomena, and that way we could develop interdisciplinary studies between IR and history. Thank you very much.